Welcome to everyone joining this webinar on land grabbing in Brazil. My name is Jeff Frank. This webinar is sponsored by the Friends of the MST, along with our allies, Grassroots International, and the Network for Social Justice and Human Rights in Brazil. We are pleased that this webinar is being presented in English and Portuguese. We want to thank our translators, Maria Aguiar and Eduardo Simas, for their hard work. Questions to the panelists can be posted in the chat window. Please write in your language of choice, and we have someone who will translate for the panelist. Now I will introduce our moderator for this webinar, Tristan Quinn Thibodeau. Tristan is the Biofuels, Land Rights, and Food Security Campaigner for ActionAid USA. Tristan?
Thank you all for being on this call. We have an hour, so I'm going to jump right into it. As Jeff said, my name is Tristan Quinn Thibodeau. I'm a campaigner at ActionAid USA, and I'm working to coordinate an international campaign, which we call the Stop Land Grabs campaign, which is challenging this new wave of land grabbing through the financialization of farmland. And it's an effort that includes almost 20 organizations on 3 continents, because this is a very big global phenomenon. In this conversation, we're going to be talking about the role of US financial institutions contributing to land grabbing in Brazil, but there are financial institutions in Europe and Canada that are also involved as well. Just to set the stage briefly, land grabbing is not a new phenomenon, but since the financial crisis, there has been a new, dimension to it, you could say, as the financial sector has seen farmland as a speculative commodity or a speculative financial asset, and they've begun to buy up farmland. And it's been a particular class of investor that we have been most focused on, and these are retirement funds or pension funds, primarily in the global north, in the US, in Canada, and in Europe, that are buying land in often in the global south. Brazil is a major target, but they're also buying land in the United States, and in Eastern Europe, and in countries like Australia. And in many cases, they're exacerbating existing land conflicts and contributing to increased industrial agriculture. And so we'll be talking in this call about how this impacts agrarian reform, the struggle for agrarian reform in Brazil, as well as the struggle for agroecology. So right now, I'm going to pass it to the first speaker. We've got Maria Luisa Mendonça from Rede Social de Justiça y Direitos Humanos, pardon my pronunciation. And we also have Luis Zaref from the MST, the Movimento Sem Terra in Brazil. And we'll start with Maria Luisa, and I'll give a brief introduction as to who she is. Maria Luisa Mendonça is the co-director of Rede Social, and she's the editor of the book Human Rights in Brazil, which is published annually, and also the author of The Political Economy of Agribusiness. She has a PhD in human geography from the University of Sao Paulo, and is also a research scholar here in the US at the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at the City University of New York Graduate Center. So she founded Rede Social in 1999 as a result of a big process of building alliances with dozens of non-governmental organizations and social movements. And Rede Social works to use legal mechanisms to defend human rights, as well as to conduct research and documentation and publish reports, videos, books, and articles to support movements. In 2015, Rede Social published a report based on their research exposing the role that international pension funds, and especially one fund I think we'll talk a lot about, the US-based retirement management company TIAA, and the role that they were playing in buying land from land grabbers in Brazil using a complex legal structure to avoid Brazilian law restricting foreign ownership of farmland, and contributing to deforestation and destruction of Cerrado land, and as well as violating the rights of communities. And Rede Social has continued this research and has been leader in international efforts to challenge land grabbing and financial speculation. So I'll turn it over to you, Maria Luisa. I think you're still on mute.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for organizing this conversation. I'm very happy to participate in this. We started to look into this process of financial speculation right after the collapse of the housing market in the US after the economic crisis in 2008. At that time, especially after 2010, we were looking into a joint venture of agribusiness corporations in Brazil and oil corporations to produce ethanol. So we were doing research about the impacts of expanding monocropping of sugarcane in Brazil. And one particular company was Cosan, which is the largest sugarcane corporation in Brazil, and the joint venture of Cosan and Shell, the oil company Shell. They created the largest producer of ethanol in Brazil. And part of that was a subsidiary that Cosan created at that time called Radar. And that was a new type of phenomenon in Brazil. Radar was a rural real estate corporation. And so we started to look into Radar. And then we found out that the main source of funding for Radar came from TAA-CREF, which is a pension fund here in the US. And TAA created a large corporation called TAA Global Agriculture to target farmland around the world. And so then we also found out that TAA received funds from pension funds in Europe and in Canada. And we started to partner with organizations in Europe, in the United States, to look into that. Even before we started to do specific research on the ground, with communities on the ground, we knew two things. We knew that when a large corporation, such as TAA-CREF, sets up a fund to buy land around the world, that already creates a process of speculation with farmland. And that puts rural communities in a vulnerable position all over the world. And at the same time, we realized that the main target was control over land. But in order to justify that, they promoted the expansion of monocropping of plantations, of sugarcane, of soy. So the expansion of agribusiness was, financial speculation was the main cause of expansion of agribusiness. And that is still the case right now. And we also realized that at that time, the price of agricultural commodities was going down in international markets, but the price of land continued to increase in Brazil. So there was a disconnection between the production of agricultural commodities and the price of land. That confirmed our theory that the main reason for financial corporations to buy land was control over land and not necessarily the production of commodities. So also we realized that at that time, several agribusiness corporations in Brazil were going bankrupt, especially sugarcane corporations. So I did research during several decades, and the Brazilian agribusiness claims that it contributes to about 40% of the GDP in Brazil. But actually, if you do research about the amount of debt of agribusiness corporations and the balance of trade, what they produce is debt, actually. So I think we need, with this research and with this conversation, we need to also challenge the myth of development. Now, with the fires in the Amazon and the Cerrado, the huge destruction that is happening, a lot of people in mainstream media talk about this as development. And we know that it's all about destruction of natural resources. That also means that the level of agricultural productivity is decreasing, because when you destroy the soil, the water sources, when you destroy biodiversity, you cannot have a productive and healthy agricultural system. We also need to differentiate that what these corporations produce, what agribusiness corporations produce, are mainly four commodities: beef, timber, sugarcane, and soy, that are main cause of environmental destruction and climate change. So Brazilians, social movements in Brazil are calling for a boycott of these four commodities. So we are not talking about the production of food. We also know that more than 70% of food production is done by small farmers in Brazil and internationally as well. So also, the process of land grabbing is the result of an alliance between multinational corporations, financial corporations, agribusiness corporations, and local rural oligarchies in Brazil. So there is no contradiction. For example, when the Brazilian government uses a fake nationalist discourse to defend the destruction of natural resources, it doesn't make any sense, because multinational corporations are benefiting from that destruction as well. So it's not about development, and it's not about benefiting Brazilian society. And the social movements in Brazil are in the center of this global conflict about natural resources. And for example, in the case of land speculation, a main target is a region called the Mato Piba region in Brazil, in the states of Maranhão, Piauí, Tocantins, and Bahia. And that is so-called the last agricultural frontier, where there is a great deal of land speculation, and these multinational corporations partner with local land grabbers, and that creates a lot of impacts, social impacts of hundreds of local communities being displaced. And this is also based on a neo-colonial view, as if that land is empty. And of course, we all know that there are millions of people, rural communities, that have been in the land for many generations and have the right to land. So we have been working with local communities, and before we started to work, that these communities were isolated. It's a very remote area of the country. And now, after building alliances with local social movements and international organizations, we have been able also to advance the right to land and produce tools, so the communities have a very good organizing structure now, and are fighting to claim the right to land. And also, there is a risk for clients of TAA here. For example, many university professors have their retirements managed by TAA, but they don't have any choice. So, but after TAA, for example, or other universities, for example, we also study Harvard University Endowment Fund that is also speculating with land in Brazil. And but after a few years, when you expand monocropping of soy or any type of plantation, you also start decreasing the productivity of the land, because you destroy the soil, you destroy the water sources, you destroy biodiversity. And of course, now with the pandemic, that represents a huge risk for public health, as well as for climate change. So when we talk about communities in Brazil, we are talking about something that relates with every every country in the world. So we all have to engage in defending local agriculture, ecological agriculture. And I think Luis is going to speak more about this later. But I think that in the global north, in Europe, in the United States, we see that there is public opinion in favor of production of local food, ecological food production. But in the global south, these multinational corporations are implementing the neo-colonial model of monocropping plantations. So we need to challenge that. And we need to transform our food systems everywhere in the world. We're not going to be able to deal with the right to food, climate change, public health, if we don't transform our food systems and that, and make them based on agroecology, which is something that the MST and Via Campesina have been doing for many years now. So at the end of the talk, we are also going to give you more information about how to get engaged with this campaign against land speculation. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Maria Luisa. Folks, if you have questions, you can ask them in the chat, but we will answer them after the presentations. So next we have Luis Zaref, who is in the National Coordination of the Landless Workers Movement of Brazil, the MST. The MST, I think as many folks know, has been a leader in the struggle for food sovereignty, agroecology, and agrarian reform in Brazil for decades. Luis is also the state administrator for the production sector, I believe in the Brazilian state of Goiás. And within the production sector, Luis works on the agroecology front. Luis has been a member of the MST since 2002. And Luis is a forest engineer with a master in agroecosystems and a doctorate in agrarian geography. So Luis, I will pass to you.
I'm going to speak slowly then. I will make my presentation. Yes. Yes. He's asking if his slide appeared.
Okay.
Então, boa tarde, boa noite, eu não sei.
Good afternoon, good evening. I'm not sure where each of you are. As I was introduced by Tristan, I want to thank you on behalf of the MST for the opportunity to bring you more information about land grabbing and also what we have done in terms of fighting against this aggression through popular struggles. And it's very important to us to have these spaces to talk about this because we have in Brazil a fascist project in control, and the mainstream media also still defends the perspectives of the elite. So these spaces that are offered to us where we can show what is going on, and I am bringing this presentation because there are some graphics that even though they are in Portuguese are important to be able to show you, and will confirm many of the things that Maísa Maria Luisa presented before me. So I would like to first situate, contextualize that we are a country in Brazil that has a very high level of concentration of income, and it's also got the second highest level of land concentration in the world. Much of this is a direct result of the legacy of slavery and the control of land.
I'm wondering, he's not showing the slides. We just see the desktop. I don't know if that's what it's supposed to be.
Luiz, a gente não está vendo os slides, a gente só vê o pano de fundo do computador.
Ah, é?
É.
Então, peraí.
So they're saying that they're not seeing the slides of his presentation, only the screen saver or the screen.
Será que agora vai? E agora foi?
Yes, here it is.
Ótimo.
However, this whole presentation slide is in Portuguese. There's a very high degree of concentration of income and land. For the period of 38 years before the abolition of slavery in Brazil, there was a land law that was passed to concentrate land ownership in the hands of large-scale landowners. And so, of course, in the 150 years since that time, we have continued to have the same kind of lifestyle, particularly in the interior areas of the country where there's a very high concentration of land ownership of huge tracts of land. And so the struggle for agrarian reform in Brazil has a struggle that's been taken on to be able to try be able to access some 8 million hectares, which is about 16 million acres, but they're in the hands of large-scale haciendas or latifundios or farms. There are 200 million hectares of agro husbandry, 67 million of grains, including soy, and 11 million in forestry. And so we've had a continual struggle between the small-scale farmers, family farmers, the indigenous people, and the Afro-descendant people to have an agrarian reform. And so in 1988, when the struggle was post the dictatorship, the struggle to define a new constitution, we fought for the demarcation of land that would be either for indigenous territories, Afro-descendant territories, and agrarian reform. And we also advocated for the designation of conservation areas, particularly in the Amazon and the Cerrado. In the majority of the cases, those designations were not made. The process that was defined in the Constitution under law, it has not been taken forward into practice. So it's important to understand how land grabbing and land theft is occurring. It's occurring primarily in public lands where there was no designation by the state of indigenous territory and Afro-descendant territory, or areas where the small-scale farmers and farm workers have taken over land production, agricultural production. So the whole process of land grabbing is very involved with violence. So for instance, here in Goiás, where I live, where we have encampments, or for instance, in the Amazon region, depending on how far they are away from the cities, we are living a life of violence because the large-scale landowners, either they have their own security forces, or they contract with militias, or they contract with elements from the military to threaten, destroy the land productions, or let the animals loose, or ultimately with homicides. We've had a very important and very serious wave of massacres in the area of Mato Grosso. This is very characteristic of this kind of violence. It's assassination of leaders and the families of leaders to threaten communities. So together with this violence, it's accompanied by a form of deforestation. It's also accompanied with mining, and also, for instance, the cutting back of the valuable wood from the forest areas. After that, they set fire to those areas. During the months of rain, the violence increases, but after the rainy season, the areas are burnt, and then the people who are engaged in this land theft will come during the rainy season, the next rainy season, and they will put seeds for hay and grasses to put. Now, this slide in Portuguese shows the number of rural properties by class and by area. And this is the total. 2018 is in red, where it shows that in 2018 there's a reduction in general, but you'll see that there is an increase in the large scale land holdings that will be from 250,000. Oops, I missed that. And then you'll see that in the area of small scale or medium scale size, there's been a loss, as you see in red. When you see the increase in the overall size of the holdings, you will see that the large scale latifundios have seen an increase of more than double of the size of the properties in 2016, I'm sorry. So what you're seeing is 230 million hectares of land that were taken over by the large-scale landowners. So we're seeing something that is the size of 150 million hectares. We're looking at something that is more or less the size overall of 1/4 of all the arable land in Brazil. Down on the smaller end of the scale, you're seeing the small scale and medium-sized properties. And so no new land holdings for small scale production and indigenous people and Afro-descendant people has not increased at all from 2016 to 2017. What you see taking off is the large scale So the number of large-scale holdings increased by 13%, but the size of those holdings increased by 47% in that 2-year period. So this campaign resulting from this land grabbing and the relationship to the Bolsonaro government, there has been a paralysis, a stopping, large-scale paralysis of agrarian reform, completely stopped. There are still 60,000 families from the landless workers movement that are still in encampments waiting to get access to land and waiting to be settled. There has been no further access to technical assistance or financing for the families living in settlements. And there has been a very aggressive process of privatization of the lands that were settled and privatization of public lands where the small-scale landless workers, farmers and landless workers have taken over public lands that have a right to be on those lands. And what's happening is that the federal government is privatizing, or they're facilitating the previous large-scale landholders to purchase those lands, to reconcentrate the ownership of lands that were freed up through previous agrarian reform struggles. So they're also targeting those public lands for burning and for renewed ownership in the hands of large-scale landowners and agribusiness sector. So this land grabbing campaign was also supported, the campaign against land grabbing was also supported by environmental organizations alongside the indigenous organizations, Afro-descendant organizations. But for instance, the deforestation that has occurred in the Amazon region, and also the burning that we saw in the Pantanal, in the Cerrado, and in Amazon was record levels, never before seen, and also the degree to which there has been a militarization of the agrarian issues and environmental struggles. So now we are suffering through threats of evictions and deforestation and burning. So our response to all of this is we in the MST are convinced that this reality, we, along with other organizations in the countryside and in the cities, are convinced that agrarian reform is a central element for change in Brazil, for social justice, because agrarian reform brings with it social justice. In 2018, for instance, we have seen that 18 million Brazilians, I think he said 18 million, are suffering from hunger. 110 million who are either food insecure or are going hungry. So that's almost half of the population of the country that is food insecure. And there is a brutal level of inequality. Agrarian reform takes care of our collective goods. They produce, the agrarian reform settlements produce conservation areas and defend conservation areas. All of the settlements are required to have at least 20% of their land in conservation. Also, agrarian reform settlements produce healthy food with the agroecological project that the MST has taken up. It also reduces the tendency to urbanization and increases democracy. Where there is agrarian reform, the votes for fascist projects is very reduced. And so that is why we're pushing for the public lands to be destined for agrarian reform and return to the agrarian reform project. And we should push for a 10-year project to plant 100 million trees to confront the environmental destruction that has been promoted by the Bolsonaro government and the elites in Brazil, and that we also want to promote agroforestry that is based in a foundation of agroecology and agroforestry to combine food production with reforestation.
Well, thank you very much, Luis, and thank you very much, Maria Luisa. So now we have time for Q&A. So the way to ask a question is to just put it into the question and answer box down at the bottom of your Zoom. There is a question that says from Andrew that says, I have to leave. Is it possible to have a recording, a copy of the presentation? And I believe that we are recording this, and it will be, I'm not sure where it'll be posted, probably the Friends of the MST website, potentially, or on the Facebook page.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, look for there if you have to leave. But
Excuse me, it will also be available probably on Rede Social and any other Grassroots International, any other place that wants it.
I see another question in Portuguese, which I unfortunately cannot read. Is there somebody that could translate that for me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So yeah, could the panelists please explain the significance of the phrase interiorização do país? So what's that, like?
Interiorization.
Interiorization of the country.
That question is for Luis. Yes. And so that process, what we were talking about, of the concentration of land holdings in Brazil from the decades of the 1950s and 1960s, created a rural expulsion from expelling people from rural areas into cities, where we have now huge cities like Recife, Salvador, Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, that has a very high concentration of people who in extreme conditions of income inequity and inequality. So when we are talking about an interiorization of the country, is to be able to create a situation where people can leave these major urban centers and return to the interior of the country. So for instance, in my area, there are about 2,000 families that control all of the agribusiness. And 30% of the populations that have been displaced into the cities live based on government handouts, because they have no other mechanism for earning income. And the cities are just dying with the weight of all these displaced areas. The smaller towns and smaller cities have lost so many people that they're in a state of decline. So if we create a process of agrarian reform that attracts people to go back into the interior areas of the country, we will be helping to correct that problem.
So there are three other questions right now that have come up, and I'm just going to ask them all right now, and Maria Luisa and Luis can answer whichever one is relevant to you. One question is, how can people in the US support these efforts? I think probably that means support the MST's campaign, but maybe also support the campaign challenging financial companies buying land in Brazil. Another question is, I think this is related to the context in Brazil. Are there mayors or legislators that are anti-land acquisition? But maybe this is also the US, I don't know. Are any elites taking a stand against it? It seems like with so much violence and destruction that some political elites should take a stand against it, but is it too dangerous? Or is there just no political move towards this? And then the last question is for Luis. Is there already a forum or a space for discussion that brings together the MST, indigenous organizations, and Quilombola communities to discuss and address this issue? Which I assume means this question of Grilagem and foreign financial companies buying land. I don't know who would like to go first, Maria Luisa or Luis?
So Luis is saying that Maria Luisa can go first.
Yes, to get involved in the campaign in the US against land speculation and to help pressure pension funds such as the GAA and also the Harvard University Endowment Fund, we have a campaign here with the website that you see on the screen. We have a collective website, stoplandgrabs.org, and several organizations participate in the campaign here. So yes, it's possible to get involved. If you go to the website, you can sign petitions, you can read several reports we have been publishing on this issue. So, and we also started specific outreach at universities for students, faculty, and staff of universities to get involved. So if you go to the campaign, you can find more information about that as well. We have a toolkit also for people to mobilize. So there are several ways to get involved. And in terms of the second question, the local elites, like I said before, are very much part of land grabbing in Brazil. And multinational corporations then take advantage of these local land grabbers that operate on the ground. But at the same time, for example, with the communities we work with, they have been able to mobilize locally as well, and to partner with local universities, unions, other social movements, and to pressure, for example, the local legislative assembly in the state of Piauí. And we also work with grassroots lawyers that support that process. So they were able to include in the new land law locally specific points to make sure that local communities can have access to land as a collective process. So the land regularization will be done collectively, not with individual titles, which the World Bank and other organizations have been pushing for privatizing agrarian reform settlements, for example, to give individual titles, and that represents a risk that this land then will be put in the market. So we defend that peasant communities, in the same way that Quilombola and indigenous communities can have collective right to land, that is a way to protect the communities. We also have been partnering with local public prosecutors and judges, but there is a risk also. For example, one of the local judges that started to cancel these titles based on fraud, based on our research, started to receive death threats. So it's very important to have international attention, because that is also a way to increase protection for local communities that have been, they receive death threats. That is a constant situation of risk of violence by local agribusiness corporations that hired private security pistoleros, gunmen. So whenever this happens, if we are ready to have, if we have an international campaign that can respond to that, that is very important to increase protection of local communities against violence.
Posso então?
Yes.
Então, apenas complementar, acho que o professor
Also, just to complement many of the
reforçar isso do boicote.
points that Maísa has raised, I want to reinforce the idea of the boycott,
Esforço de denunciar
the effort to denounce what is happening in Brazil
ela é muito
through international financial corporations.
quando a escala é
This has had a big effect in Brazil, even when the scale is not that big.
mas tem impacto
So
poderoso no Brasil esses
there is a
ações
strong impact,
e também
and the actions that we have taken to boycott the commodities. And also, it's very important to highlight the role of the battle of ideas. So, for instance, even this 15 minutes to explain the whole process of land grabbing, how it's linked to violence and violation of human rights, and to deforestation, and to the fires and the environmental impacts. It's very important to have that dialogue about land grabbing. So, for instance, we have a really famous rap artist who's Anitta, and she engaged in this, and she made statements about the Grilagem, the land grabbing, the slang terminology that is used in Brazil, and she has millions of viewers because she's been very popular singer. And that one word became the most highly looked at word in the Google in Brazil. And so here in Brazil, there's a lot of people are very underdeveloped ideas here in Brazil. And so, for instance, there's a lot of researchers, artists, other movements, and including people who are elected officials at the local and municipal level who have been able to engage with us
Estamos parando a diminuição de vereadores,
with,
prefeitos e prefeitas que são ligados à defesa
with this campaign, and we've been able to, even after the Bolsonaro and the soft coup
sobre os fóruns.
and the Bolsonaro election, we've been able to at least stop the reduction of the number of friendly Congress people and friendly mayors. And we do have movements that are coalitions here in Brazil, that are coalitions where we have, for instance, the National Alliances of Indigenous People. We have the National Alliance of Agroecology Organizations. We have the social arms of the church that are agricultural pastoral groups. So there are many forums and many groups and many coalitions where people come together to coordinate the work around this campaign.
So thank you, everybody. There's one question left, and I think it's a really good one. And then we will end the Q&A. I know we're at hour, but we're just going to go a little bit over. Hope folks can join and can stay on for a few more minutes to give Maria Luisa and Luis a chance for some closing comments. But the last question is from Fernanda, who's a student at CUNY in New York City. And she says that the media in Brazil is focused right now on how Bolsonaro's anti-environmental policies right now are making big foreign capital leave Brazil. We talked about the boycotts and things like that. But I think what we're talking about in this webinar is how it's framed as if big foreign capital coming to Brazil is a good thing. But what we're talking about is how this is actually a big problem, both in terms of protecting the environment, but also in terms of just basic development and human rights. And so how do we deal with that? And is the MST or other agrarian movements talking about or thinking about how to create an environmental agenda that questions these kinds of developmental models that have been implemented in Brazil and which are harmful? So it's a pretty big question. And maybe it's for Maria Luisa and Luis.
Yes, there is no such thing as local agribusiness in Brazil without the large multinational corporations that control most of the production of chemical inputs that large plantations are based on. Pesticides, chemical inputs, that are actually a main cause of climate change. That the market for these chemical inputs is pretty much concentrated by large multinational corporations, and then the same as the trading corporations. That the commodities in Brazil, really what they produce, what agribusiness produces, is promise of production of a few commodities that then will be negotiated in future markets, in financial markets, by large trading corporations. So at the same time, like we described before, that is this alliance between local elites and multinational corporations, financial corporations in this process of land grabbing and expanding plantations. And although, we see that they claim that what they do is sustainable, a large plantation cannot be sustainable. A large monocropping plantation depends on large use of chemical inputs. They usually fumigate pesticides by airplanes. That this has a huge impact, environmental impact, and impact on public health. And it's not about food production. And it also has an impact and decreases agricultural productivity because it destroys natural resources. So they keep expanding, and the process keeps expanding, and then we see more and more destruction. So I think the only message that the Bolsonaro government is going to pay attention to is if there is a boycott of these 4 commodities. It's very difficult to do this as an individual, to boycott these commodities. So I think the way to work on this is to pressure, for example, Congress members in Europe, in the United States, to increase tariffs, for example, not to have trade agreements with Brazil. So I think working on policy, international policy, is the best way to try to stop this. And of course, like I said before, Bolsonaro uses a discourse of fake nationalism, but the goal is really to open the Amazon and the Cerrado to large mining and agribusiness corporations that, again, is an alliance of local elites with foreign corporations. So we need to denounce that.
And Luis, do you have a response to this question? And maybe you could also give your closing remarks.
Tá bom. Primeiro, há sim uma crítica.
There is a criticism of the media in Brazil of the Bolsonaro government, but it is important to understand that the mainstream media also represents the elites. And as the professor says, they defend the supposed sustainable agricultural, large-scale agricultural production. The mainstream media does not talk about land grabbing. They talk about the burning and the fires, but they never say who's doing it, who's behind it. And they do defend other aspects of the Bolsonaro policy, such as privatization, and they defend the international capital and the international corporation. And what the mainstream media presents does not respond to the real problems. And so what we have put here, the MST has, along with other movements, understood that the environmental issue has to be together with the agrarian issue. You can't separate the two. You can only conserve Amazon and the Cerrado, and you can only confront the fires and the deforestation if you strengthen the rural people and the people who will conserve the land and the water in the countryside. Only if you have more agrarian reform settlements, only if you defend the indigenous peoples and their territories in the African, because agribusiness is just about the destruction of the land and the environmental resources. So defense of the territory, conservation of our public goods, the land, the water, the air, the binding of land access to the question of defending the land, the water, and the air is one construction that cannot be separated. And that's so our situation in Brazil is very difficult. It's grave, but we have built and are building many pathways to resist and to push for change, because the solutions put forward by the Bolsonaro administration and the elites in Brazil will not solve our problems. We will have more hunger, more unemployment, more destruction of the environment. So we are convinced that the path of agrarian reform and defense of indigenous and Afro-descendant territories, as well as food sovereignty and environmental preservation, are the pathway forward for Brazil. Thank you.
Maria Luisa, would you like to give your closing remarks, or did you already?
So thank you again for organizing this. I think it's very important for people to get involved in this effort, you know, to build solidarity, because we're talking about key issues that have to do with people all over the world. They're talking about health, food, the environment, climate change, protecting biodiversity. So, and the Friends of the MST is a great organization also for people to get involved here in the US. So thank you all for organizing this, and happy to contribute.
Well, thank you to Maria Luisa and Luis for joining and for giving such great presentations. Thank you to Friends of the MST for organizing this, and for everyone who joined and stayed past the hour. I think we all really appreciate you. And I posted links into the chat for the websites of the US Friends of the MST, as well as the Facebook page and the Stop Land Grabs campaign. And the Facebook page, and you can also go to the website of the MST in Portuguese, and also Rede Social. I can put that in the chat as well. Jeff, do you have, is there anything else to add?
Thank you, Tristan. I want to thank Maria Luisa and Luis for an excellent presentation. I always learn so much when listening to folks from the MST, and of course, Maisa has been doing this for so many years, and every time I read an article from her, I learn so much. I was just going to give a quick note that as we said earlier, this webinar has been recorded in both Portuguese and English, and we'll circulate it around and get it posted on various websites so people can have access to it. And we also are going to post information on these campaigns that were discussed by Luis and Maria Luisa that will help so people can get involved. It's really important for people to get involved, particularly from the countries where this money is coming from, because we know that the financial corporations in North America and in the rest of and in Europe have no interest in climate and changing climate change. They have only one interest, and that's increasing their own profits. And that is why we need a grassroots campaign to stop this. Information was shared on the screen about the Friends of the MST, our website, as well as the website for the MST. Keep looking, please check there. We'll have more information as well as this video. So again, we thank everybody for participating, for joining in. And as I saw in the chat, a luta continua.